To Fresh from the Studio. Today we are doing a special Austin Public Library edition. We'll hear from artists Susan Scafati, Hollis Hammonds and Sasha West, Sarah Welch, Rakhee Jain Desai, about either work they currently have on view or upcoming exhibitions that they will have with the Austin Public Library. The way it works, each artist will have 10 minutes to present. At the end of the presentations, we'll open it up for your questions and comments for all the artists. Feel free to chat your questions, observations, or comments during the presentations, and we'll loop back around at the end and address them. Today, we will begin with an introduction from the exhibition coordinator for Austin Public Library, Beth Kim.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Beth Kim, and I'm the exhibit coordinator at the Austin Central Library. I oversee all the gallery exhibitions, including the main gallery and the living room gallery on the 6th floor, and art installations, outdoor and indoor, and any other community projects, smaller scale to big scales. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to work with all these artists. It's been a great learning experience, and I'm thankful to Women in Their Work Gallery for hosting us to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we'll start with Susan Scafati.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Can you see it?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, great. All right. So, well, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to speak to, let me just see if I can minimize that. All right, so this is my work that's in the Austin Central Library downtown. And this project was truly a dream come true. I got to work with a lot of wonderful organizations here, and the Austin Public Libraries were awesome to work with, and Beth and City of Austin, Texas Cultural Trust, Big Medium, Vault. It was really an amazing project. And I find that it's helpful when I talk about these installations, their relationship to light. And here are a couple of pictures of me experimenting with light. And I think that the ideas that are in this installation and in the installations I've done around town really are rooted in some of my very earliest works. So I wanted to show a handful of my early work in photography, because I think that it will show a different side of this work and how some of the themes that I've been working with over the past few decades are really rooted in these ideas that go back to early experimentation with light. And so when I was 14 years old, my grandfather gave me a camera that was broken. And I used to spend a lot of hours in the darkroom overcompensating for the light leaks. And so I would do all kinds of things to the photo process. Sometimes I would put salt onto the paper. Sometimes I would tone it with different things. Sometimes I would shoot through broken glass. And so I was always doing different things when I was taking the photographs, when I was working with the enlarger and in the darkroom, and also afterwards when I was printing it. And so really central to these early works were light refraction, color combinations, and also this relationship with reality and illusion. And I think that was something that was always really interesting to me, that idea of perception. And here you see, these are all manipulations I did in the darkroom kind of between like 14 and 16 years old, where I was actually literally putting plexiglass or glass onto the paper, and doing different things. And eventually I started making works more sculptural, working with plexiglass to sort of build out these boxes. But still working with like anything from beeswax to salt to green tea to coffee. And so I think over time, when I look back at my work, I see that I was always either sort of, there's kind of two parts to the way I work. One is sort of setting up a scene or a stage, and the other is photographing it. And so here's another example of that, where I'm photographing through bubbles. And so it's, again, like really interested and drawn to that light refraction, and still having this like very strong degree of light experimentation. And, you know, eventually, starting in my early 20s, I started living in these downtown urban centers. And at this point, I've lived most of my life in downtown areas. And really central to that experience is seeing cities constantly construct and destruct. And that has been very true in my time in Austin. And that's something, you know, I spend quite a bit of time walking around. And I think over time, I just really developed this fascination with construction materials and the way that some of them, you know, they're made of these sort of hyper-reflexite materials that are really designed to catch your attention. And at the same time, the culture was changing because the introduction of smartphones really changed the way that we communicate, but also the way that that we can represent ourselves in our worlds, because all of a sudden everyone had cameras in their pockets with a lot of tools to manipulate the photographs. And then, of course, the influx of social media culture, where we have selfies, and we have all these different kinds of filters you can put on your photos and your videos to sort of show your world. So that was really interesting to me. And I think that between this sort of landscape of construction physically and this landscape of construction psychologically, I started to think about the two together. And I started to make these really large scale installations in the form of text boxes. And so these are large text boxes that were combining plexiglass and here is an installation I did at the Facebook office downtown. That's 4 stories. And what I love about these is that people actually would go into these windows, and they would photograph through the plexi. They would photograph these sort of collages that they would make. And they would also photograph the change of the light in the space. And that was very similar to what I had been doing growing up in the darkroom, just kind of playing with the light. And so I felt like I was making these stages for other people to go into to photograph the light. And this is in some of these pieces, I had people from the community write onto them. So there was like this handwritten messages onto the text boxes that were in different languages. And here's an installation of the same body of work that was at the CoLab Project's demo gallery in downtown Austin. And this wrapped around the block, and people would come in and photograph the environment. This was at the Bonsack Gallery in St. Louis. And people would go in and they would look through it, and they would see the way that the world looked different when they looked through it, but they would also photograph themselves. And so that was one of the reasons I really was attracted to the material of plexiglass, because it not only had a collage kind of filtering quality, but also had a reflective quality that acted like a mirror. And in conjunction with this project, I did these archival pigment prints. And these are layerings of sunprint, color darkroom, and digital layerings of hand-cut, hand-drawn, and projected text boxes. So I would combine and layer over and over and over, and work with different kinds of light, both natural and synthetic light, and do all kinds of things to, you know, mess with the paper and do different compositions. And then I started to hone in more specifically on the social media culture of filtering, of the way that people were really manipulating the images, and how you could sort of think about different things about the variations of perception. So I made these really dealing more with filters. And then I just started to make the filters really large. And here's a picture of me working on the library installation. And then, you know, I put it up, and I think that what has been such a joy to me in this project is that in a way, this installation is a measurement of time, because it's always changing. As the sun's path changes, all these lights in colors and forms move across the space. And I've actually have this sort of what I think of as like a light community, where people send me pictures of the light changes, and they go in and they photograph them, and they really spend time in the light. And that was really an honor to me to be a part of the community in that way. And so this is a picture that was in the Austin American Statesman. This was an Austin Woman magazine. This is the recent K Jewelers commercial, where they staged it to look like an airport. And this is a Black Pumas music video. So I love the way that the community was going in and using this. And then I also just really became obsessed with looking at Instagram and seeing the way that people were just doing different, posting their one-offs of just sort of close-up geometric abstractions, or of them spending time in the space, or of the way that the colors and lights looked across as the sun changed. And people were using different kinds of cameras, and they were, using, shooting different light. And I also, go in a lot and like just sit in the light. And then that leads me to my latest work. I started to incorporate natural elements into these lighting materials that I've been using. And I started to become more interested in these kinds of interventions between our natural and built environment, and working with the same kinds of light material that I was using in this installation for the library, but really bringing in wood and shells, and then also bringing back the relationship in my early work with photography, where, like I was saying earlier, I set up a stage or a scene and then I photograph it. So these are photographs I've taken of the recent sculptures that I've been making, and this is what I'm working on right now. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I think that is just my time up.
Thank you so much, Susan, and happy birthday.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Next up, we have Hollis Hammonds and Sasha West. They have a collaborative exhibition up now.
Hi, I'm Hollis, and Sasha's here with me. We're going to take turns speaking and probably talk over each other a little bit. So I wanted to start first by just talking a little bit about my own studio practice. And since Women in Their Work is hosting this event, I thought I would share the work that I had in 2015. So it's been quite a while since my show Women in Their Work at the old space, but it does give context for my work in general, which has been about personal narrative. It's been about storms and disaster imagery, both natural and man-made disasters. But I want to talk more about a collaboration that I've been doing with Sasha. As you'll find out very quickly, Sasha is a poet, and we both work at St. Edward's University. And so we've had a couple of opportunities to work together in sort of an organic way. In 2017, we were at a faculty retreat, and I asked Sasha if she would share a poem with me that I could illustrate in some way. And so she gave me this sweet poem. This is not the whole poem illustrated here, but just a few images, called Umwelt. And the thing that was great for me about this collaboration is that Sasha's willingness to share her work and to let me play with it. And so we've been kind of doing we had been doing these sort of small collaborations, but have been doing a much deeper collaboration more recently, where actually what happened is Sasha was doing a reading in our gallery at St. Ed's, and I was just so overcome by her words and her her performance of reading these words she had written. Then I had an exhibition coming up, and I was like, would you work with me? I was just really excited and also scared. And luckily she said yes. She gave me her complete manuscript that she had been working on for years, and she'll tell you more about it. And again, I spent a lot of time like reading her work, and I started making these kind of automatic drawings, some with text, some without, but really just reading her poems and then just doodling on paper. And I'm using ink on drafting film. And I have sort of these, since we're doing fresh from the studio, I thought I would share a little bit of process. So I'm reading these words, I'm super impacted, and I started just making these drawings in response. And of course, they are an accumulation of my own experience and my own life. And so that's another kind of magical thing about our collaboration, is that our work was already parallel, thinking about the environment, thinking about storytelling and narrative. But you can kind of get a feeling for the material. This is ink on UPO, which is it's a manufactured paper, so it's very artificial, like plastic. It's probably made from petroleum, and a lot of this work is about the environment and about thinking about how we use fossil fuels. So I love this sort of complex dichotomy between the materiality and then also the ink kind of becoming like an oil slick. At the same time, I was building these sculptures because, again, I had this large exhibit coming up, and I had this idea for an installation that responded to Sasha's work. And so I was building these trees, or totems is what I call them. They're completely recycled materials. Like, these are all materials from my home. And you can kind of see me cramped in my garage studio trying to build these large sculptures. So part of this process was trying to understand how to build multiples, how they could be structurally sound. These are stacked sculptures. And these are also sculptures that have been adapted for the current exhibit at the library. So I thought it might be fun to show this a little bit. You know, our work is about a lot about objects. We'll talk a little bit about that, and how they could be used or reused. Of course, recycling is important to us. This is just an image of that show being installed. And then the last thing I want to show before I hand it off to Sasha to talk more about her work is a drawing that I created for the exhibit at the library, which ends technically today, but it will be up tomorrow as well, if anyone wants to go and see it last minute. My studio is too small for this, so I was working in the university gallery. And this work that's part of the exhibit, I had to, there was a point where I turned it upside down. So I just thought it was interesting to show kind of the evolution of a thing. It's like very large, multiple pieces of paper, and the sort of cumbersome quality of the thing. I'm going to pass it off to Sasha.
Hey everyone. So yeah, Hollis was talking about this. I've been working for the last 10 years on a manuscript that explores climate change. And it started with the seed of this word that Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined, which is solastalgia. So it sounds a little bit like nostalgia, but what it describes is what it feels like to be in your home and watch it rewritten by environmental devastation. And so the manuscript sort of started with one daily speaker who is our everyone's kind of stand-in for what is it like to be in the middle of watching all of this unfold. And then the other second speaker in the manuscript is Cassandra. So you may remember she is the Greek prophet who foretells the Trojan War and no one listens to her. And in my book, she's a woman who has access to all times at once and who can see what's coming, but she doesn't have the ability to get others to see it too. And so you can see in Hollis's drawing that what an amazing job she's done of making the land feel like something where all things are simultaneous, like all histories of that land are happening in that half of the mountain at the same time. And as we were coming together, we were really thinking about two kinds of intersections. And one you can see in these pieces is this quote that Japanese film director Akira Kurosawa has, which is, to be an artist means never to avert one's eyes. And I don't think that that's necessarily the only thing that art is, but I think it's been really important to me in my poetics. It's important to the act of drawing. It's important to sort of looking at disasters. And I think that what we were both finding in our separate work and then in our collective work is that to not look away from climate change, to not look away from the environment, means that you feel a lot of grieving. And so we were thinking about this show as doing part of what Timothy Morton calls grief work, really giving us a collective space to look at something hard that we can mourn, but really looking at it through these suspended moments. So if you can go to the next slide, thinking about things like this single house on fire, this single disaster foretells future disasters so that you feel that moment radiating out. And then as we were talking about that kind of looking, on the next slide, one of the very first pieces that we knew we wanted to include in terms of the poetry was this poem, Ode to Fossil Fuel, where what I'm trying to do is not just sort of despair and make fossil fuels the villain, but really look in a more wide-ranging way. And so, you know, there was a real reckoning at a point where I realized that fossil fuels have literally made my life. I mean, not just sort of the transportation that I do or the objects that I have, but that without the Industrial Revolution, as a woman who grew up working class, I wouldn't be a working poet. I wouldn't be a professor. And so this poem starts as a kind of gratitude to the paper and reams that have come from forests. And it doesn't turn away from the difficulties, but it just tries to kind of gather everything in and still look at the sixth extinction. And so this piece, you'll see in the next slide, the installation, the totems that you saw that Hollis putting together, there are speakers in them, and so they radiate the sound of this ode to fossil fuel, so that you're sort of there with the objects, both looking at them and kind of hearing their histories, hearing both the beauty of them, but also hearing the devastation that they bring. So really just trying to look at material realities in all of those ways. And then the other thing we really wanted that felt really important to both of us was this idea of accumulation. When you're thinking about climate change, it's so big, it's like impossible to hold everything that it can be everywhere in mind at once, but it really is made up of these tiny gestures. It's made up of the stories that we've been telling each other about the world for decades. So like if you're thinking about those totems and maybe the TV dinner tray that's in one of them, that yes, fossil fuel is in the factories that are making those objects, but we're touching them every day in the way those objects come into our lives, and they accumulate into these totems and into landfills and into landscapes. And so it was really important to us to think about the layering of small things, the layering of gestures. And you can see that also if you get a chance to visit the library and see that beautiful drawing that has all of these drips, you really get a sense of how long these pieces take to create. So you're kind of inside this time of them. Hollis, do you want to say a little more about the exhibition?
Sure. Sometimes it's a little slow advancing. Try again. There it goes. I just thought I would bring in a couple of images. These are the two entrances. One, like as you're looking towards the entrance from either side. And so when you enter the gallery, there are kind of these nice moments where you're just sort of seeing drawings, and there's some video and other poems on the walls that you can read. And then eventually, let's see what else I have here, which is again really slow. Go. I don't know what happens, but sometimes it gets stuck. So here's a little bit of a video that we included, and then the installation. The one problem that I feel like I'm having is that it's really difficult to photograph. Like I actually really love this show. This is kind of another irony, is that I'll put a show together and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, great, I did it. But I'm not always like satisfied, or rarely am. And this is a particular show that I think works well. But it's really something you have to see in person. There's not really a great way to encapsulate how it works or how the narrative of the show works through photographs, or even us kind of describing it for you. Kind of gives you a little bit of an idea also of the scale. The figures are life size, they're at our eye level. And so as you walk into the exhibit, and although you can't hear the sound here, you're surrounded by the sounds of the poems being read, and really have an opportunity to start thinking about these issues from a personal point of view.
Yeah, and I'll just say about that I think we've been talking a lot about where this collaboration goes next. And I feel like there's seeds in this show, in that we've put up some of the books that were meaningful to the poems. So inviting people into that investigation. We have these handouts that are exercises that are sort of ways of looking that led into some of the poems. So thinking about things like, if you look at the coffee cup, if you look at the lid on a to-go coffee cup, and you really think about its long life, it came from the crushed bones of dinosaurs and fossil ferns, and it was made in a factory with people you'll never meet. It traveled across the sea to you. It's in your life for like 10 minutes, maybe an hour, and then it lives on the earth for 200 to 500 years. So every time you hold that tiny object, you're encountering this mini eternity and this whole globe. And how do we find a way to sort of look at objects in their longer history again? And I think about the totems as like that moment of hope, right? That objects can become something else, that they can be flexible, that we can have a different relationship to them. And then we're also trying to figure out, how do we see a way forward? So we've come through this kind of grief. How do we move through grief into a kind of remaking and a different kind of storytelling? And also, how do we do that as people whose aesthetics are interested in disaster and ruin? So yeah, so I feel like there's pieces in the show that are pointing us to the next collaboration.
Yeah, I think that we're almost out of time, but I'll just say that it's been such an honor to work with you, Sasha. And I think both of us, being artists that have had a sole practice, an individual practice, where we're separate all the time, thinking on our own for a long time, and building a body of work over many years, it's refreshing to be able to bounce these ideas off of each other. And we are really excited about what the future of this body of work could have. So we'll end there. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing your exhibition. So it sounds like we can see it today or tomorrow. Then
Yes.
The next upcoming artist, I believe your show's opening December 11th, is Sarah Welch.
Yes, that's right. December 11th. Oh, there we go. Well, I feel very well set up now to talk about the next show at the library. My work, I guess I should start by saying that I'm actually based in Houston, and a lot of the work I do is about the Gulf Coast and having that like cultural vulnerability to climate change. And for the last couple of years, my way of working has been to write comic books and then produce reading rooms that are installations that go along with those comics and have different ancillary drawings and sculptures and things that reflect back on the narrative of the comics. And that's what I'm doing at the library coming up for the show Outpost. And this is a continuation. This is the third chapter of a comic book series called Holdouts. Here's chapter 1 and 2. And I produced a reading room for each of these as well. And this is sort of a near future sci-fi sort of comic about what a Gulf Coast might look like, 20 years on. And today, I'll show a little bit from the comic and talk about the story. I'm also going to try to focus in on just like one part of the upcoming show in Austin, which is like a collection of ceramics that go along with the book. So these are risograph printed. I do all the illustration and the writing, and my partner, James Beard, does the printing, and we've had a working relationship for over 10 years where I create stuff and he prints it and we collaborate. So it's about 24-ish pages. And each of these stories focuses on a different protagonist. And then we're following that protagonist to see their particular circumstance and how they're enduring with like harsh climate. Also, the narrative is made to be shifting gradually inward, like away from the coast, with the idea that the rising tides are pushing people backward centrally into the US and away from the coast. And so it starts in an area that's like, say, like where Galveston might be now. And then one book is Houston and one is like even more centrally located. And let me share my screen and we'll jump to the pictures. Okay, how does that look? Can we see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, here's the cover of the comic. Here's a scan of one of the pages just to give a better impression what they look like. Not last year, in 2019, I was at Skowhegan working on the second book in this series. And I had an opportunity to do some ceramic work because the facilities are available. And I ended up making this one artwork, which ended up in the reading room installation. It is really odd and it's a bit outside of what I make. I don't do a lot of ceramics, but I got really excited about it. And I feel like I sort of achieved a new approach to making these like works that go along with the comic book narrative. And in this case, I feel like I was trying to channel the primary character and think of an object that they might make and like make something from their perspective. And this is a bit of a like reinterpretation, I guess, of Victorian mourning jewelry, which is made from like early plastics. This one is ceramic dipped in the ink I had on hand, which was for making the comics. And so it turned out really glossy in a way I didn't expect. And the charms on here, it says, where will you go? Which is just like, a question about what do you do when your home is disintegrating? Where do you go? And then into the pandemic, I started looking at more ceramic stuff and thinking about what other objects I might want to make in relation to these narratives. And one of the things I came across was palacyware. So this is an example. And palacyware is like, began as rustic wear and was like a trend started by a French potter named Bernard Palissy in like the Renaissance. And then it had a big resurgence at the turn of the century, and it was like mass produced. So most of what exists now is not Bernard Palissy's work. It's like replicas of that style. But it's usually filled with all these little creatures. And these really stand out to me because a lot of it's servingware. And I guess it, for my contemporary eyes, gives me this impression of like rot and rebirth, which is an idea I'm very interested in. And I found out that the New Orleans Museum of Art has a huge collection of this. So I got to travel there recently. And here's a couple pictures of items in their collection. These two are my favorites. And so this was sort of a starting point for me to think about, oh, what is like Gulf Coast specific, you know, objects that are sort of, you know, we assume they're functional, but they seem almost more like altar objects or something with like a pseudo religious thing going on. So I started making some ceramic pieces. This is a like candelabra with a gator. There we go. Here's a frog candelabra. Some small little leaf platters with anoles and Houston toads and creatures I'm used to seeing. And here's a big picture based on that first photo. Yeah. So this was really exciting for me. Just to like try a different way of making. And I feel like I got a lot of energy out of a new material, because comics can be a long slog. It takes many months to produce the comics. It's usually a 4 or 5 month adventure every time. And I've been making one a year for the last 9 or 10 years. So doing something new was really exciting. I'm pumped to show these. This is a tiny, this is like a scale model of like an earthen home or a cob home. And the narrative in this upcoming comic book is about a woman who kind of starts a compound, like a little family subsistence farming compound, and has like an earthen built home like this. And this is sort of like the ghost of an alligator haunting her cob home. And then lastly, we have this sort of altarpiece of this mermaid figure who, being so close to the Gulf, I guess it's sort of an embodiment of a figure that's both like to be revered, but also to be feared. And that is sometimes, I think, the relationship when you live really close to the coast and you deal with like hurricanes and bad weather all the time. So she's my little idol for this book. Yeah. Yeah. How much time do I have?
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, fabulous. So those are some of the things I'm gonna be showing as part of this larger installation at APL. I'm really excited. And we'll have the books on hand. I'll have all the books there. So if you want to come by, you can read through the entire series. And yeah, I thank y'all for having me.
Thank you so much. And your exhibition opens December 11th. The next artist we have is Rakhee Jain Desai, whose show is opening in May 2022. So something to look forward to this spring.
I'm going to share. Thank you so much for having me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so this is just a view of my crazy, messy studio. And I'm going to start off with telling you a little bit about myself, because I'll give some context into my work. I was born in Canada, grew up in Houston. I am of Indian heritage, so my parents immigrated to the US in the 60s. And as an adult, I've lived in several places, Japan, India, and Singapore being the most recent. About my work, one big thing about my work is that I really like to tell stories. So generational stories, immigrant stories, and inevitably personal stories come through in my work. Community engagement is a really big piece and component. It really fuels the inspiration. My inspiration and working amongst communities to create is really important to me. And then lastly, playing with light, transparency, and texture has been really something that has been a central theme in my work. And that leads me to talk to you about a method that I've been using. It's a textile method called batik. And this is something that I learned when I was living in Singapore. I've always been a painter, and I used to do oil painting, but while I was living there, the oils felt really heavy and they never really dried because it's a super humid tropical climate. It didn't feel right. And I was drawn to this method, and I'm going to show you a video to explain how it works. It's a resist method. So I'm going to turn off the video. So it's a resist method where you use hot wax with this tool called the chanting, and you create a barrier in the textile. So the dye doesn't penetrate beyond the wax. So you're creating these little borders with it. And then, 1 second, see if I can. Okay, there we go. And you can see that the light, with this method, light really permeates really well. So it becomes something that is transparent after it's washed. So this is the wax that's washed off. And you can then, I use it in two different ways. I look at the light in two different ways so far. One is you can collage with it. And so that's some of the work that I've been doing. And then secondly, I've been using it as, soft walls and installation work. So this is some of the work that is collaged. It's turned into a painting, but there's layers behind it. This one as well. There's another one with layers of textile behind, found fabrics, designed and printed fabrics underneath the batiks. This is another one. And you can see kind of the layers in this image. This is a piece that was done in 2018 with AIPP's Tempo program. This piece, I had worked with various organizations around Austin to express their vision of home. So they were mostly asylum and refugee seekers that I was working with in organizations such as Casa Marianella and several others. And we worked on expressing their vision. And you can see here that then their pieces were then collaged into the big piece. And you can kind of see here that there's, their visions, mejor oportunidad. And then the fabrics that were actually used were cotton fabrics that neighborhoods in Austin had donated. And so there's a Donald Duck that's coming through. And so a lot of that, that when you collage this work, it comes through from the other, you can see it from the other side. So I just absolutely love that component of this. And then I also have been going in a direction that is more of installation, and you're able to experience the work from all angles. So this is a collaboration that was done with a a quilter in Brooklyn. We were both living in Singapore at the time when we did this together. And there's some tapestry work. This was most recently at Dorff Gallery in the last exhibit. So there's tapestry work. You can see it from both angles. The first image is an image from the front, and the second is from the back. So you can see how it kind of lights up. Yeah. And then, oh yes, okay. And then in 2020, I really went in this direction when I was in the CRIC group. We were in the depth of the pandemic, and one, vaccine is not available at the time. I mean, what really became apparent to me is the loss of a generation, and that's my parents' generation, and the loss of the connection to my ancestral land, which is India. So that, you know, I'm going to show you how this is the piece that came out. And I really wanted to create these soft walls and for people to really be immersed in the installation. There's layers of articles and things that were on my mind. These textiles are family textiles. My mom's engagement sari is that one right there. One of the silks is something that has been in my family for 200 years. This is the one right here, that silk that's hanging. It's been in my family for 200 years. Apparently, my great-great-grandfather had a silk factory in northern India. This is a sari that my mom was gifted by my grandmother, who's now passed away. So there's a lot of significance that's coming through here. And as I was gathering these materials and talking and just working with them, a lot of the stories of that generation came forward. So I'm really in the process of documenting and gathering those stories that really formed, you know, I guess that went along with this generation. Let me try to, sorry, skip this 1 second. Went along with their generation in their integration process in the US and also in Texas, because they pretty much lived in Texas for 45 years. So this is another angle where you can see walking through. This is the frontal view. This is at the Grey Duck Gallery in 2020. And then now at the Contemporary, at the Crate Group Reunion Show, this is my work. This piece, the inspiration derives from memories of my mother's ancestral home, a 300-year-old Haveli in central Jaipur. And during that time, while I was creating this work, I lost my grandfather, the last grandparent that I had. And it were really, a lot of these textiles are from his journey. There's a bedspread in here that I'm utilizing the texture to ground the work. You can see at the bottom here, that's the bedspread of my parents' bedspread, their wedding bedspread. These textiles that are hanging above are things that are swatches that my grandfather was trying to import to create a business in the United States. And I'm really playing around with the cut work here and using light in that way. And the significance of that are the windows that existed in this home. And the windows were interesting because they're symbolic for me. My grandmother's generation used to look at the world through those windows because they didn't go out into the world necessarily all the time. They had this system where they were covering their heads, so a veil system. But when I would visit, it was something that was really playful for me. That it was a room that I used to play hide and seek in. And so it's really kind of seeing all the different vantage points with that, yeah. I don't know if that made sense. If you guys have any questions, let me know. This is an installation view. It's on until January 16th. And then another one. This is more of that same exhibit. This is something I'm working on again, playing with light in a different way in a sculptural form. This is going to be in Houston at a neighborhood center. I'm working with 2 other artists based out of Houston. And there's a huge community engagement component of that where we're gathering letters from the community and then printing them into the work. But these are all going to be hand-painted batiks and other textiles, hand-painted works. This is the exhibit, some of the exhibit that I'll be exhibiting at the library in May. This exhibit is specifically referencing the cultural significance of floral bouquets and cut flowers and ceremonies. So, and to our ancestral connection also, and the celebration of the use of flowers and celebrations, and also to express grief and rebirth. So a lot of my work right now is about that, really just about ancestral connection and grief and ceremonies. So yeah. And so this is where you can see my work right now, the Jones Center, and then ABIA, that's a permanent exhibit, and then upcoming Austin Central, and then in Houston. That's all I've got.
I want to thank all the artists so much for sharing today. It was really interesting to see some of these connections between layering and things like, and dealing with contemporary issues with all of these different mediums that you're all working with. But that there's maybe some connections through layering and these different types of materials. It's really cool to also see how you all are experimenting with new things right now. And so I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. I can ask some of the ones that were typed into the chat during today's talk. So we had one here from Alicia Philly. It says, it's interesting to hear how collaborators find each other and decide to work together. I'm curious to know if Sasha is involved during the installation choices. If yes, what does that look like? If no, how do you make that choice?
So I have not been involved in the actual installation, thank goodness. Hollis has done everything, and we've talked a lot. We've talked about sort of what pieces will be. So I feel like our collaboration is sort of like these ideas fit together. These totems could create this wood, and she says these things, and then she just goes off and makes magic happen. And she's like, "This is what I did," and I say, "I love it," and then it's in the space. So in some ways, the collaboration has been much more where are the ideas intersecting, and then just this like deep trust in her eye. And it's also been really interesting because there are some things where, like, she showed me that the last piece that we showed, Revisionist History, where there's 3 layers of poems, and so she was like, well, what do you think about this? And I said, oh, I wanted at one point to make a book that was all transparent pages so that you could see the poems. So I think there's just such deep aesthetic overlap that some of the things that were surprises felt very right.
But I have to say, it's super intimidating to take someone's work and to make work out of it, and not, like hoping that it's right, that it's not going somewhere that it shouldn't be going, and that it's not, overstepping in any ways. And so we do talk a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a really good collaboration going on, and you have so many of the same ideas and aesthetics that it seems to work really well. And then we have another question coming up from Rachel for Rakhee. How do you feel having your precious heirloom textiles available for anyone to see up close and possibly touch?
Well, I wouldn't like them to be touched, but definitely want them to be experienced. So walked around. And I think that what I really want to experience is kind of seeing the light through them. I think that's really important to me, for them to be able to be seen through and to be able to see the layers. So in some of the installations, you can see like one of the textiles is layering in front of the other. And the textiles are actually creating windows, figuratively and literally, into an insight about my life and my ancestry. Yeah, and so I prefer that they're not touched though.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then we have one more for Susan here. Have you ever experimented with water? Curious how reflection and light would affect the work.
Yes, great question. In my very earliest works, I used to take photographs of water and then collage it with other photographs to get the sort of sparkles and light refractions that happen. But I'm also a swimmer, and I think a lot about the light refraction that happens underwater. And I think that sometimes I'm trying to create that in the sculptures I make or in the installations I make. I would love to work directly with water. I would love to get an underwater camera or something and really experiment even further. So thank you for the inspiration.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I could really see that being a part of your work, that sort of overlap and the light and everything. And then we had another question for Sasha and Hollis. Beautiful drawings. They're very poetic and the poetry is very sculptural. Texture and form are beautiful. To all the artists, love how you're all thinking about material, collage, and context. Does anyone else have any questions here in the audience? Feel free to just unmute and ask them or type them into the chat and I can ask them for you. I also dropped all of the links for the artists in the chat up above for their websites and Instagram. And if anyone has anything coming up as well, exhibitions or things like that, feel free to drop those into the chat as well. While you're pulling those together, I'll go ahead and let you guys know about a couple of things coming up at Women in Their Work. On December the 11th, on that Saturday at 11 a.m., we have a talk about with Rakhee Jain and Agustina Rodriguez and Carrie Kinney from Prizer Arts and Letters that'll be talking about our current exhibition, Pattern Language, that you can still feel free to visit during our normal hours. And all of the info to RSVP for that is on our website.
Can I also just say to June Beth that I'm amazed at just sort of how all of these exhibitions are so different, but there are ways that we're all inviting the viewers in to become collaborators in the work in different ways. And I just think that June Beth does such an amazing job of using this public space to find art that brings us together and brings us in and just helps us see differently. So I'm really grateful to her.
Yeah, I was also going to say there are just so many commonalities across the different projects, from Susan to Rakhee, like this use of light and transparency, and also just narrative. There's a lot of storytelling happening, and of course our connection with Sarah with climate change. And I'm just Sarah also, I'm super interested in those sculptures and how they are, because we think a lot about how we use objects, like found objects, like Rakhee using your personal objects. You know, they're so loaded. And then you're creating these new objects that still have all this sort of narrative and context in them, that, and also really feel like this sort of future narrative of like these things that we might be making after these disasters. So interesting to me.
I mean, Hollis, I've often thought about what am I going to do with these, as I create these new pieces. Now they're for me in my context, but it's interesting. I think you brought up a really good point in using these found objects and creating new ones, and what's the life of those afterwards.
Yeah, there was a long time where I was using the objects from my parents and grandparents. Like I had already mined all of that material. And then at some point I shifted away from it. And then it became like all objects that remind me, right, of my childhood or these memories or these people. And so how objects can have this complex meaning I mean, I think it makes sense that they come from this personal place, but then they get transformed even in Susan's work, like seeing how you're taking like your early photographs and collages and transformations getting to what you're doing now is so fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I wondered how you were thinking about the organic objects with the plexi, because those are these two very like kind of futuristic but also ancient things like stuck together.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of my work over time has dealt with rituals. So I'm always really interested in why we do what we do, both individually and collectively. And that those works were inspired by this ritual called grounding. And it's the act of touching nature to ground oneself. And so I started making those works, during lockdown, when I felt like a lot of people in my life were talking about these very simple gestures that were grounding them. Like people in my life were telling me, I took off my shoes today and I walked on the grass and it was so amazing. Or I went swimming with my children in the river, or I just sat and watched the leaves blow. And they were talking about these sort of epiphanies associated with these very serene kind of reconnecting back to nature. And so I started to think about that kind of like the meaning that we bring to these rituals and how they influence our lives individually and collectively. And and so I started collecting. I actually had a lot of nature already collected, shells and driftwood and things, and I started making it out of that. And then it just kept going.
So Susan, do you see those objects? What will be the final product or the artwork that you will display? Are they the objects or the photographs of those objects? I mean, they can be both too, but I was just curious.
Yeah, thank you for asking, June Beth. And I have to say on that note, June Beth is always, I feel like, so cerebrally and almost like spiritually connected with the art, with my artwork and just with other artwork. I feel like she's such a blessing to work with. And we're so lucky to have her at the library. She's brought in so many amazing projects. But to your question, I think that what I'm really working on right now is really drawing out the relationships between the photographs and the sculptures. And so I want the photographs to feel immersive. And I feel like with photography, I'm almost always pushing the boundaries. Like I always kind of like resist that idea that they're just these kinds of rectangles on a wall. So right now I'm trying to make larger prints and have them kind of working more, like intersecting more with the sculptures. I just brought them to my studio for the first time all together a few weeks ago. So now I'm seeing the way that they relate to each other. But in my dream, like in my birthday wish is to have a Lazy Susan show where the objects would be on Lazy Susans and they would be like spinning around. So you could walk in and you would see the objects from different angles. And then there'd be like these photographs kind of coming out from the corners and the floors and the ceilings. And they would just be like, wild the way that nature is wild.
Still have time. I think I was thinking of another connection between all of our work is the spatial installation. And I just wondered how each of you think about that. Like like Susan, you talked a lot about it and showed all those images, right, of people utilizing your work or being in front of it or behind it in different spaces. Yeah. And I was curious, Sarah, like how your reading room, like how does it manifest like physically or feel?
For me, for the reading rooms, they've been different with every comic iteration, but usually it's just supposed to, I mean, part of it is to create like a sort of a world building action that extends outside of the comic. So you can, exists somewhat in the narrative, right? So sometimes it's wall painting. I've done shows with lots of like vitrines filled with like fake like artifacts like that exist in the books. I've done some small animations that are sort of like yeah, an extension of the sequential art in the comics. So it's a little bit different every time.
Yeah, how about like I think of the like Rakhee, you were talking. I mean, I think the video is really helpful, like to show us how we would be able to walk through and into a space and like see through the fabric. And I definitely think about like the scale of the thing and the body, like of the viewer, is really important to my own work. I don't know what you guys think.
I also think there's something about time. Like Susan, you had talked about that sort of that record of time, how the pieces look different depending on the weather and the light. And Sarah, you were using that word sequential art. Like I think one of the things for me as a writer coming into a gallery space that has been the biggest pleasure is that my poems get to be unmoored from time. You know, they stop being these linear things where you enter at one moment and move through in this prescribed direction and then you leave at a given moment, but it's like you get snatches of them, you get little pieces of them. And so that way, like I envy that about visual arts, how it sort of creates this space where I don't know, time unfolds differently. Time, you have to, it depends kind of, does the viewer walk around this way or do they walk around this way, what the piece ends up being for them. Yeah, so just as a writer, that movement of I think what you were saying, Hollis, like that movement, it's not just sort of the body, it's also the movement of the body and how that creates the work. I was really struck by that, and everyone's talking.
Thank you, Sasha. Yeah, I think it's so interesting in these to see those through lines through everyone's work and like those little connections that maybe just looking at the work straight off you don't notice, but as you take a little more time and hear from you all, those connections that we can make. And I want to thank everyone again for being here today, and a special thanks to June Beth for collaborating with us on this program. It's been so great to see the range of work that's in the libraries here in Austin. And thanks for everyone for participating and asking all the great questions. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.